On Invest Africa today, we are unpacking Africa's rail sector. Hello and welcome. I'm Nozi Pombandra. Now, moving goods and people by rail is the cheapest, most efficient and most reliable way to do so, particularly on a continent as vast and underdeveloped as Africa. Over the past decade, major intra-African rail projects have kicked off, such as the Mombasa-Kigali Railway in East Africa. And this, of course, will link the port of Mombasa in Kenya with Tanzania and landlocked Rwanda, as well as South Sudan. And we're also going to be looking at PRASA, which of course is the rolling stock program in South Africa that we know will be moving more than 2.6 million commuters daily. How does this fit into the broader rail picture? But before we get into it, let's take a quick look at this project known as Gibela.
Our main mission is to provide the train and the associated services in order to achieve the great challenge the Deputy Minister has just mentioned. So this is our vision, to be a catalyst player allowing PRASA to make that great change. We know that nevertheless our challenge is not only to deliver train and maintenance activity, it's much more. Our mandate is also to revitalize the railway industry in the country, and given the magnitude of this contract, we will have also to provide a lot of initiatives in economic development for the country, jobs related, skill development, and a lot of other focused on blackboard-based enterprise.
And joining me now is Debay Scott. He's the Head of Infrastructure Advisory and Major Projects, this at KPMG, and Vishal Lachman, he's the Divisional Director in Development, Transportation and Infrastructure at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to join us. Debay, let's start off by just getting a history of rail investment in South Africa and on the continent, and in particular trying to really understand why this renewed surge and focus on the sector.
Good morning. I think rail investment is, the word investment is really what it's all about. There's been a complete lack of that. South Africa per se goes back just on metro rail, doing the basic passenger transport, well over 40 to 50 years when the last previous major investments was made. So that's why the Gibela in it that you've just spoken about is so critically important. It's a well in excess of 100 billion rand program over 10 to 20 years that will be the first real public transport program on the continent. Now that's in South Africa, you know, a reasonably developed country relative to Africa. Those challenges are still faced, you know, north of us. So it's of absolute critical importance, the steps we've taken here on the passenger side,
right,
and on Transnet, on the freight side,
yeah,
because that drives economies, you know, the investment in certain of these corridors.
Absolutely, and I think you raised an important point, and perhaps, Vishal, we can pick up on this, especially as we're still looking at the broader landscape, the importance of rail infrastructure in economic development. Has this been sufficiently understood, and does it receive the priority that it should when it comes to economic planning at a national level?
I think it was always well understood. I think it is now that it has been prioritized. For many years, and again in keeping with what Debay has indicated, I think that we all know the value of rail. It is now that rail has been prioritized in the capital programs of PRASA and Transnet.
But gentlemen, where did the step change come in? Because for a large portion of time, road has been, you know, attracting a lot of the freight business. Where did the step change come in? Is there a specific moment in time where we said this is when the switch happened and rail became important once more?
I think road, you're 100% right. Road has been and still is, you know, the primary transport sport. It's highly inefficient. You know, the more north you go, the more landlocked, you know, countries you get. For example, the Zambia copper belt.
Yeah.
To take that copper into the export market takes a convoy over 20 days of traveling on the roads before they get to the market. So you can imagine what that does for the cost of that export. So it's all about eventually realizing if we want to be competitive, we want to be in the global space, we have to invest into the more efficient mode. So that, I think, is the trigger.
So, Vishal, we're definitely hearing that this is a recognition of efficiency and improving on the ease of doing business. But again, the other point I think Debase raised earlier was a lot of the investment is still in South Africa. And if we look at the rail network compared to the rest of the continent, most of it, at least 80% according to research, resides within South Africa. What does the picture in the rest of the continent look like?
I think, coming back to your question on the step change, I think there was an important point on how we realized that. For example, Transnet, if I use that as an example, has spent many years investing a lot of capacity in ports. In other words, ports are now the point of intermodal transfer of goods. In order to realize the capacities in all of the ports in the country, the rail had to come as a second initiative. So now, to complement the existing port capacities, rail has now been prioritized in order to balance the capacity of the various corridors in the country. And I think that is where the step change came from. The realization that the ports are now well equipped generally, and and rail will now have to be put into place to bring the volumes to
You
the
raised
ports.
It's the concept of pit to port.
pit to port.
Everybody talks about that. We are a resources continent. That's what we do. We don't really manufacture a lot, but we've got very rich resources, which we have to, as quickly as possible, as cheap as possible, get to its eventual customers. So that's why the ports and the mines and the rail, it's like a pit to port cycle, which is completely interlinked with each other. It's complex. It's not simple to get this all to work properly. It's very expensive. So that, I think, is the sort of realization that that's really what we have to do.
But you're also raising the interconnection with the resources industry that rail is highly dependent on for demand. And I want to go back to the point you raised, Vishal, about Transnet. You've put Transnet on the table, and we know that they have a very ambitious demand-led strategy. And lots of critics have come to the table and they've said, why would you put capacity before we've actually...
Need for new entrants to enter this market.
So a clear realization, but is that realization translating into an actual equitable distribution of participation in these investments?
I think reality is that it will take time. I think Transnet has got what we call an industrialization, economic development program, which is earmarked at the established manufacturers re-establishing capacity in the country. PRASA has got a very intense program through Gabela in establishing a local passenger train capacity. The site has been identified. There will be a factory built in on the East Rand and Donater that will employ thousands of people, directly and indirectly, in building the capacity to build new passenger trains.
Right.
So that's a 10-year program, and the whole idea being that there's a scaling up of how much of the investment of the country into this new fleet will remain back in the country, i.e. reinvested into that, and it's legislated. So I think South Africa has learned a lot of lessons on industrialization and how to build capacity, and I think we are slowly getting it right.
I want us to focus a little bit on passenger rail that you've just put on the table once again, Debase. In South Africa, there's a perception that's very different from if you're in another market like the UK, in particular London, where the usage of the tube is commonplace. How do we change the perception among South Africans that rail is a preferable mode of transportation? We've seen some step changes with the Gautrain, but is that sufficient, and can we make bigger changes?
Well, the Gautrain, for example, is so successful that it's right now in the midst of assessing additional coaches, as well as doing feasibility studies on new networks. So, that would not have happened if it's not successful and if the demand's not there. I think the demand is absolutely clearly there for some alternative transports. Because, if you just look at our highways and what they look like, and the log jams for, the times are just expanding. PRASA, has always been faced with the metro process that is not reliable, that's old, that is probably not that safe. Every now and then there are accidents. It's been said the new metro fleet will take double the amount of people at double quick amount of time. Now, even if that is roughly thereabouts, imagine the impact on the economy.
The new metro fleet, though, would it, in terms of affordability, because this has been one of the key criticisms that have been leveled against the Gautrain, that it's efficient, it's fantastic, but it does not really cater for the ordinary person in Gauteng who needs to access that kind of transport. Are we looking at something that looks at the mass market and that could possibly, Vishal, be a real alternative for people who are not at the apex in terms of the income bracket?
I think at this time, it might appear that the Gautrain serves a different market. I think in time to come, and the initiatives that have been put in place from PRASA side, I think, again, it will take a little bit of time, but I think the strategies are accurate and correct in the way they want to transform their business. If you look at the new rolling stock, visually, very similar. The quality and the levels of service for the new rolling stock, again, very similar. So I think in time to come, once it's rolled out and implemented, I remain very optimistic that it will start to attract a market and start to integrate different markets.
Well, on that point, we've just taken a look at a broad overview of rail in terms of freight and ended our conversation by looking at the passenger element of this conversation. Let's take a short break now, but when we come back, let's dig deeper into the financing of rail investment on the African continent. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with Invest Africa. And still with me in our Johannesburg studios is Debay Scott. He's the head of infrastructure advisory and major projects at KPMG, as well as Vishal Lachman. He's the divisional director in development, transportation and infrastructure at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. Gentlemen, welcome back once again. Debay, let's start off with who's putting their money on the table when it comes to rail infrastructure. Who's funding these ambitious projects that we're seeing not only in South Africa but that are crisscrossing the continent?
I think the answer to that is fairly simple. If you look at passenger transport, the metro transport, that's really the first entry level of basic transport for the blue-collar workers and the people who simply cannot afford it. That has always been and will always be a subsidized, government subsidized, heavily subsidized financing. It's the best affordability you can get on that. As you move a little higher into the users of the product, and the Gautrain starts to use, especially on the airport rail link, you can see it in the price differentials as well. There, the users starts to fund these thing a bit more, but it's still heavily subsidized. So transport. Freight is a very different game, because freight has got the pit to port argument, the mining people who's keen to move the goods into the ports and into the export markets. All sorts of take and pay agreements prevail. Levies are being used in certain areas. So the financing of the freight products is a very different concept compared to passengers. Let's
focus on financing of freight as a starting point, and really also begin to understand here who are the players in the funding matrix. Are we seeing public-private partnerships coming to the fore, or is this still heavily reliant on the national purse?
I think we are slowly seeing PPPs coming to the fore. I think Transnet, in particular, who's the player in South Africa, has had such a strong balance sheet historically and still currently that it's got the internal capability of financing a lot of these with its own cash flows. So between some early degrees of PPPs at Transnet, but mostly their own internal cash flows, and then structured transactions, project finance transactions with the manufacturers on take and pay agreements to share the risks, and some of the ECA, global providers that back imported goods. So it's a whole package that's quite complex. The only one that's reasonably simple are the passenger ones that's straight government funded.
That's straight government funding. I want to touch on project finance with you just for a moment, Vishal, because this seems to be perhaps one of the key vehicles that are being levied or used to address rail investment infrastructure deficits on the continent. In a project finance deal on the African continent generally, are we finding that there are viable projects for project finance to latch onto, or is there an issue of viability that we're seeing?
I think with regard to passenger, there will always be an issue of viability. Again, in keeping with what the base has indicated. Typically, globally, these are always subsidized transport systems. However, seeing that we also have an opportunity to link freight to passengers, there is possible opportunities to integrate these two systems, similarly to South Africa, to integrate these two systems to further assist and make passenger more viable.
So, of course, and I think that's a very important point that you put on the table, this capacity to integrate so that we improve viability. But I want to talk about integration from a different angle, Debase, and this is integration at a regional level where you have multiple governments who are involved in the ensuring the viability and the financial viability, really, of projects coming to fruition. What's the ease of doing that on the African continent right now, especially if we're looking at the coordination of their regional policies and the like?
The unfortunate answer is not easy. That's why it's not happening that quickly. It's difficult to do it. These things are expensive as